There's a courtroom inside your mind, and you don't even remember installing it. It's not loud, it doesn't shout or slam gavels. It whispers, it watches, and worst of all, it never sleeps. You wake up with it. You fall asleep beneath its gaze, and even in your silence, it's still deliberating about you. You want freedom, but you find yourself obeying invisible laws you can't explain. You follow them like a well-trained citizen, yet no one told you where they came from. There's no tyrant on the outside, but something inside has become the tyrant. Immanuel Kant called it the moral law within. A noble idea, he thought. The voice of reason, dignity, and duty, rising from your own soul. But what happens when that voice, instead of guiding you, begins to haunt you? What if that inner law becomes a blade you hold to your own throat? This isn't about anxiety as restlessness or worry. This is about the kind of anxiety that comes from trying to live up to something you can't even name. The kind that has nothing to do with failure and everything to do with violating an imagined standard. A phantom law that you believe, somehow, you're always close to breaking. And the most disturbing part? You wrote that law, or so you thought. Kant believed in autonomy, the power to give yourself your own rules. But in the modern psyche, autonomy morphed into self-surveillance. Now, you don't just obey the law. You are the lawmaker, the enforcer, and the criminal, all at once. There's something deeply lonely about that. Something cold. It wasn't always this way. Before Kant, Aristotle spoke of balance, of learning virtue not through strict rules, but through practiced harmony. He saw ethics as a rhythm, not a cage, where desire could be refined, not punished, where failure was part of growth, not a sentence of guilt. But you weren't raised by Aristotle. You were shaped by a culture that prizes rational will above emotional truth. That tells you to do what's right, even if you have to kill parts of yourself to do it. And so now you sit with it. The quiet tension. The contradiction that fuels your anxiety. You want to feel alive, but you're terrified of breaking your own invisible code. You crave spontaneity, but fear that freedom will make you unworthy. You no longer fear judgment from others. You fear judgment from yourself. This is the existential dilemma Kant never fully escaped. He wanted a moral system that didn't depend on God, society, or instinct. But in doing so, he built a system that lives in your chest, one that doesn't need walls to trap you. You fired your gods, you fired your teachers, you even fired your parents. But you replaced them with a tribunal inside your own mind. And now, you can't leave the court. Maybe this is why you feel so tired. Not because you failed, but because you're constantly being watched by something you created, yet no longer control. And maybe, just maybe, your anxiety isn't weakness. It's your soul, protesting against the prison of a law it never agreed to. Let's go deeper. It starts in small moments. The pause before saying what you actually think. The tightening in your chest when you're asked to rest. And your mind calls it laziness. The way you reanalyze every decision hours later, wondering not if it was useful, but if it was right. You live with a constant hum beneath your thoughts. Not chaos, but hyperorder. A silent architecture of rules you never consciously chose, yet follow with religious devotion. This is not the kind of anxiety that screams. It tightens, it measures, it evaluates. And the worst part is, it all feels so normal. Kant spoke of autonomy as moral maturity. The moment you no longer need an external authority to tell you what's right. But what he didn't see, or perhaps didn't admit, is how quickly autonomy becomes tyranny when infected by perfectionism. When the one writing the rules, is also the one punishing you for breaking them. You create laws in your mind, ethical, personal, emotional, and then you collapse under their weight. You begin to fear your own reflection, not because of what you've done, but because of who you might not be. Not morally wrong, but not morally worthy. There's a strange kind of guilt that lives here. It's not about action, it's about essence. A deep, bone-level suspicion that no matter what you do, you are somehow violating something sacred. And yet you can't name it. You can't even explain why you feel this way. You just know that you do. This courtroom doesn't need evidence. It needs only your own conscience, distorted, magnified, turned inward like a mirror that only shows your cracks. You're not just on trial. You're also the judge, the prosecutor, the executioner. Every verdict feels final, and you never get to appeal. And so you overthink. You hesitate. You ruminate. Not because you're unsure, but because you're terrified of betraying that invisible moral script. The one that whispers, you should have known better. Even when you couldn't. Even when no one taught you how. What makes this courtroom so dangerous is that it hides under the illusion of virtue. You call it integrity, responsibility, maturity. But deep down, you know it's something else. It's shame wearing the mask of ethics. It's fear pretending to be discipline. And that's why your anxiety doesn't go away when you do the right thing. Because in this court, right is never enough. Worth is never earned. Peace is always postponed, and the trial never ends. There's a moment just before you act, when something inside you hesitates, not out of confusion, not even out of fear, but because every decision feels like a moral test, a final exam with no clear questions and no second chances. You want something, but as soon as you feel that desire, another voice rises. Cold, precise, emotionless. It tells you what you should do, not based on who you are or what brings you alive, but on what would be universally justifiable, what would pass the Kantian standard, what would make sense on paper, even if it breaks something inside you. This is the split, the fracture Kant carved into the modern soul, between duty and desire, between what's universally rational and what's deeply personal, between what you're supposed to want and what you actually need. And so you begin to doubt yourself, not because you don't know what you want, but because you no longer trust it. You filter your instincts through a grid of abstract rules. You sanitize your decisions until they're pure and lifeless. Over time, this moral filtration system creates paralysis. You spend more energy justifying your next move than actually living it. You hesitate before speaking, loving, resting, even breathing, because everything feels like it could be wrong, or worse, selfish. Desire becomes suspect, spontaneity becomes dangerous, and your inner life becomes a battlefield between logic and longing. You tell yourself this is virtue, that this is what being a good person feels like, but what you're really experiencing is emotional starvation, because you've learned how to be rational, but not how to be whole. There's a price to moral clarity, and it's not always peace. Sometimes it's blindness, because in the pursuit of being ethically sound, you begin to mute the parts of you that don't speak the language of reason. The body, the heart, the voice of the child you used to be, before you learned to be noble. So your decisions become clean, but cold, structured, but soulless. You live in the light of reason, but something inside you is still freezing. And the worst part? You're applauded for it. People admire your discipline, your logic, your maturity, but no one sees that behind that perfection. There's panic, a quiet desperation not to get it wrong, not to be unworthy, not to be seen as someone who can't be morally defended. You're not choosing like a free person. You're calculating like a prisoner trying to earn parole. This is not ethics. This is fear in a rational disguise. This is not clarity. This is the guillotine you've built inside your own mind. And every day, you offer yourself to it again. Freedom was supposed to be the answer. The antidote to control, repression, and fear. The power to choose your path, speak your truth, live your life without needing permission. But then you got it, and it didn't feel like liberation. It felt like suffocation. Kant defined freedom not as doing whatever you want, but as obedience to the law you give yourself. On the surface, that sounds empowering, but dig deeper, and it reveals a hidden burden. To be free, you must become your own lawmaker, your own enforcer, your own jailer. And so freedom turns inward, not into play, but into pressure. You begin to monitor every thought, every feeling, every step. Not because anyone is watching you, but because you are. Constantly, unforgivingly. In the name of being better, you no longer fear external rules. You fear inconsistency with your own. You're terrified of being incoherent, irrational, unworthy of the version of you promised to become. This is the paradox of Kantian autonomy. You escape outer domination, only to be trapped in inner surveillance. Every moment becomes a self-audit. Every choice must align with your ideals. Every slip feels like a betrayal of your imagined future self. You don't fear making mistakes. You fear becoming someone you can't justify. There's no room for the messy, the spontaneous, the incomplete. No space for the version of you who's still learning, still angry, still scared. Because those parts don't fit the blueprint. They don't match the manifesto. They don't look like freedom. They look like weakness. So you silence them. You reject them. You dress up your anxiety as discipline. You hide your confusion beneath careful routines. You sacrifice aliveness for moral coherence and call it strength. But deep down, the walls are closing in. Not because you lost control, but because control became the only thing you allowed yourself to feel. The weight of always needing to make sense, to be correct, to live in alignment with some higher, abstract principle. It's a form of existential claustrophobia, a shrinking of the soul under the pressure of perfection. And here lies the cruel irony. In trying to be free, you made yourself smaller. In chasing self-governance, you became governed by an inner tyrant. In wanting to be worthy, you forgot how to be human. Because real freedom isn't found in absolute consistency. It's found in the grace to contradict yourself without shame, in the courage to grow without a script, in the softness to admit not every act needs to make perfect sense. Some just need to be lived. You don't want to be happy. Not really. You want to be justified. You want to look at your life, your actions, your thoughts, your sacrifices, and be able to say, it was all necessary. It was all right. Not in the emotional sense, in the moral one. You want to feel that your existence fits the equation, that who you are can be defended by some universal code. And that's the ghost that haunts you, not failure, not chaos, but the fear of never becoming the ideal. The version of yourself that always knows, always chooses right, always stays composed, focused, admirable. You don't just strive to be better, you strive to be worthy. As if there's a cosmic tribunal waiting for you at the end of the road, and you must arrive spotless. This is where Kant's kingdom of ends, his vision of a moral community governed by reason, begins to twist. Instead of becoming a shared structure of dignity, it turns into a solitary empire, a place where you rule as both sovereign and subject, where the laws are noble, but the cost is unbearable. You chase that ideal not because it brings you peace, but because it silences your guilt. You don't pursue perfection out of joy. You pursue it to avoid the terror of being unworthy. That's the addiction. Not to greatness, but to the absence of shame. And so every anxious thought becomes a measurement. Every hesitation, a signal that you're slipping, that you're losing grip on the standard you've elevated above your own soul. You may think this is ambition or responsibility, but it's deeper and darker. It's not about doing your best. It's about fearing that your best won't be enough, that your humanness is a stain on the ideal you're trying to maintain. You don't rest, you calculate, you don't reflect, you audit. Every moment is weighed against the image of who you should have been by now. And because that image keeps moving, you never arrive. You never touch stillness. You only get better at chasing. And in that chase, you start to forget something sacred. The part of you that doesn't want to be impressive, that doesn't want to be useful, that just wants to breathe, to feel, to exist without performance. But you don't listen to that part, because it can't be justified. It doesn't serve the ideal, so you exile it. And you call that exile progress. But deep down, you're not running toward something beautiful. You're running from the guilt of not being who you thought you should be. And the tragedy is, the one chasing perfection is already enough. You just never look back long enough to believe it. Burnout isn't just exhaustion. It's ethical collapse. It's not your body giving up. It's your soul going silent. You don't just feel tired, you feel wrong, as if rest is a betrayal, as if slowing down is a moral weakness you can't afford. We live in a world that praises productivity but worships moral worth. And somewhere along the way, you started to believe that your value depends not just on what you do, but on whether what you do is justifiable, ethical, admirable. Kant would have called it duty, but this isn't duty. It's devotion without rest, self-sacrifice without redemption. The modern mind doesn't simply think, it simulates. It constructs entire ethical universes around every decision. You don't just wonder, is this useful? You wonder, is this right? Not by instinct, but by the impossible standards of a reason that never sleeps. And so the body pays the price. You wake up already guilty. You work while apologizing to yourself for not doing more. You rest while negotiating with your conscience, trying to prove that you've earned the silence. And even in stillness, something inside you stays braced, on trial, waiting to be condemned. This isn't laziness. This isn't lack of motivation. It's moral fatigue. It's the weight of constantly living under a self-imposed tribunal where the verdict is never quite in your favor. You feel the need to justify even your most basic needs. Hunger becomes indulgence. Sleep becomes procrastination. Joy becomes distraction. Every human rhythm is filtered through a moral lens that distorts it, and yet, no one sees this happening. From the outside, you look like a responsible adult, composed, productive, efficient, but inside, you're unraveling. Not because you're failing your duties, but because your duties have multiplied beyond recognition, beyond reason, beyond mercy. You were never meant to carry this much. No one was. But Kant's shadow lives on, not in his exact words, but in the invisible structure we absorbed. The idea that to be good is to be tireless, that to be worthy is to transcend need, that to rest before your work is done is somehow shameful. But when is the work ever done? That's the trap. The machine keeps running, The tribunal keeps judging, and you keep burning, silently, invisibly, ethically. This is not a failure of willpower. It's a distortion of the will itself, a morality that forgot the human body it was built to serve. And until you question the law that drives you, you will keep mistaking pain for purpose, collapse for growth, and guilt for guidance. You've been told you're rational, calm under pressure, introspective, logical. And maybe that's true. Maybe your mind has learned how to organize pain into clean categories, how to turn fear into frameworks, how to translate emotional chaos into structured thought. But beneath that control, there's something else. There's panic, not the obvious kind. Not screaming, not shaking, not running out of breath. This panic is quiet. It wears a suit, it smiles, it plans, it obeys. It pretends to be clarity, but it's survival. Kant elevated reason above everything. He believed that the moral law must be free from emotion, from impulse, from desire. That purity of will meant detachment from feeling. But when that idea seeps too deep into your bones, something essential starts to erode. You begin to equate emotional control with strength. And over time, you stop feeling altogether, not because you've evolved, but because you're scared of what's underneath. You don't just suppress your emotions, you exile them. You translate grief into goals, loneliness into productivity, anger into stoicism. You speak the language of logic so fluently that even your suffering starts to sound reasonable. But inside, something is starving. You live with a quiet dread that if you stop analyzing, you'll collapse. That if you loosen the grip, everything will fall apart. So you hold it tighter. You organize more. You optimize your time, your thoughts, even your healing. You make spreadsheets out of sorrow. But order is not peace. Structure is not healing. Rationality is not salvation. It's camouflage. There's a part of you that never got to scream, that never got to rage, that never got to break. Not because it didn't need to, but because it wasn't allowed to. Because at some point, you learned that emotion was dangerous. That logic was the only way to stay safe. So now, your pain comes out in different ways. Not in outbursts, but in insomnia. In the tightening of your jaw. In the fatigue that no amount of rest can cure. In the silence that grows heavier every time someone asks how you're doing. And you say you're fine. You're not fine. You're functioning. And those are not the same thing. The persona of control may protect you from chaos, but it also isolates you from intimacy, from aliveness, from the part of you that doesn't want to be understood, just held. You built a fortress out of intellect, but inside, your soul is knocking at the walls, waiting, hoping, not for someone to save you, but for you to let yourself feel again. Because no amount of logic will ever be enough to quiet the heart that was never allowed to speak. Reclaiming your inner lawmaker. That was always Kant's dream. Not repression, not moral rigidity, but sovereignty. A deep, unshakable clarity that rises not from obedience, but from alignment. Not from fear, but from truth. He wanted us to be authors of our own dignity, architects of meaning. But somewhere along the way, that vision became infected by fear. Fear of doing it wrong, fear of being wrong, fear of becoming unworthy in a world where worth is measured in rational justification and moral coherence. But there's another voice, quieter, older, Aristotle's. Not a lawgiver, but a guide. He spoke of phronesis, practical wisdom. Not perfect adherence to rules, but the cultivated intuition to know what is right through experience, reflection, and balance. For him, morality wasn't a cage. It was a rhythm. And when you lose that rhythm, anxiety enters, not as punishment, but as signal. A signal that something inside you has been silenced too long. So maybe moral clarity isn't the goal. Maybe it's the soil, a place where your truth can grow, not be buried beneath shoulds and shouldn'ts. Maybe anxiety isn't your enemy. Maybe it's your will, screaming from under the weight of impossible standards. A soul trying to breathe beneath the armor of self-control. And maybe freedom, real freedom, is not the absence of law, but the courage to write one you can live with. One that includes your flaws, your desire, your contradictions. One that makes space for the child in you, not just the philosopher. Because you were never meant to be perfect. You were meant to be whole. So as you step back from this internal courtroom, this tribunal you've mistaken for truth, ask yourself this: who wrote these laws? And who do they serve? Because if the answer is fear, then it's time to begin again. Not from perfection, but from permission to feel, to fail, to free yourself from the ghost of who you thought you had to be. And finally, to become someone you can live with, not someone you have to prove.